Are you ready?
Sure, I guess.
Then welcome to Navigate LA.
Nice van.
By logging on to navigatela.lacity.org, you can have access to a wealth of information about your neighborhood and surrounding neighborhoods. Imagine having the ability to see the construction taking place in your neighborhood.
Wow, it's like really being there.
Navigate LA gives you the start and completion date, cost, and contractor involved.
Nice.
You can even get a permit for your own building repairs, such as replacing a water heater or reconstructing your own driveway. Now, you also have the ability to learn what current and future street projects are going on in your neighborhood. There's a powerful mapping program which allows you to find a particular address or parcel number and get reports on that parcel, including zoning. You can even see what flood zones are in your neighborhood.
Oh, hey, can I look up some secret information about my neighbor Joe?
No, only public information pertaining to parcel and zoning data. You can also look up the unique infrastructure feature of a neighborhood. Here, you can select specific areas and see what city facilities are in those areas, such as fire stations, parks, and much more. You can also locate council districts, including neighborhood councils.
Well, I gotta say, I am impressed.
But wait, there's more.
More?
You can select a specific area and let Navigate LA generate a mailing list for people living in that area. Just think of the possibilities, especially for neighborhood councils. They can generate a mailing list of people living in their neighborhood.
Wow. Is there more?
Ever wonder where the sewer lines are located?
Constantly.
Well, wonder no more. Navigate LA can provide you with locations and specifics.
Wow, I am completely sold. So where can I go buy Navigate LA?
Silly average Joe. It's a free service provided to you by the City of Los Angeles and the Bureau of Engineering.
Are we finished?
For more information, log on to navigatela.lacity.org.
In life, some things are pretty much a sure bet. Some things are predictable. And some things you just don't know. Unless you have ESP, an emergency survival program that prepares you for emergencies or just the plain old unexpected. You can't predict, but you can prepare.
Hola, soy Marisol, desde Canoga Park, la ciudad toda americana. Estás viendo LA City View, Canal 35, nuestra ciudad, nuestro canal.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint meeting. Perhaps the first ever joint meeting. I'm not sure, but it may, in fact, be the first joint meeting in the city's history of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee of the City Council and the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. Thank you all very much for being here and for participation in this important meeting. And I'm pleased to welcome our commissioners here who are joining us in council chambers. Chairman Abrams, would you like to say a word before we begin?
Thank you, Council Member. I want to welcome everybody. This is a historic meeting, and I hope that it is the beginning of many to come. We have our commissioners here, Vice President Gatica. Next to me is Commissioner Carlene Davis. Commissioner John Kim sitting in the wrong seat, but that's okay with me. So we're here to participate with the committee, and hopefully we will have a productive day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I am joined today, I'm Paul Krikorian, the chair of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee. I'm joined by the Honorable Councilmember Dennis Zine. Today is March 23rd, and it is now 5:15. Councilmember, I know that you may not be able to stay for the duration. Would you like to make any introductory comments before we begin?
I do have a commitment at Valley Press, and I'm pushing that till 6:30, so I'll be leaving to give drive time to the Valley Press Hospital for an event. Neighborhood councils, as a member of the Charter Commission that helped establish neighborhood councils, strongly support the community participation support, and I know that the issue on elections has been somewhat controversial and challenging at times. As you know, the budget's getting stressed more and more, so I will be with my colleague, Mr. Krikorian, the chair of this committee, to hopefully work with the group and come up with a solution for any and all issues that are going to be before us. I don't think we're taking any votes today, but hearing, gathering information, facts, and so far 100% of the times Mr. Krikorian and I have been on the same page for your pre-election, your election, and your victorious election. So with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zine. For the better part of a year, the Education and Neighborhoods Committee has been focusing on policy measures that we can take to improve the effectiveness, efficiency, transparency of the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment and the individual neighborhood councils, and to make this very important exercise in direct democracy and community empowerment even more successful and effective than it has been, and we've made some great progress in that area. We've taken unprecedented steps to try to solicit public input into that process, including a series of town hall meetings that we've had, an actual formal survey that has been open to all to participate in, and similarly, the neighborhood councils themselves, as well as BONC, have taken significant steps to try to draw input from the public into how to make positive policy improvements. One of the areas that has been an especially challenging one is the administration of neighborhood council elections and how to do so in a way that both provides a system that has integrity, cost effectiveness, predictability, and involves the greatest number of people, both as voters and as candidates, as possible. And that is the principal purpose of our meeting today. That's the sole agenda item, is hearing the report of the Neighborhood Council's Elections Task Force, and we will be proceeding to that momentarily. We'll be conducting public comment at the conclusion of that report. So if you would like to provide public comment either on this agenda item or any other item within the jurisdiction of the committee, please fill out a white public comment card and bring it up to the front, and we'll get to you as soon as we've heard the report. So with that, Mr. Powell, if you could please call item 1.
Item 1, Neighborhood Council Elections Task Force to present verbal report relative to the recommendations on how to proceed with the Neighborhood Council elections.
Thank you. And we have with us today, representing the Neighborhood Council's Elections Task Force, Doug Eberhardt, Leonard Schaefer, and Bob Gelfand. Gentlemen, how would you like to proceed?
Let's start. Thank you, honorable council members and commissioners. I thought I would spend a very few minutes, 5 or 6 perhaps, to talk a little bit about why we're here and the history of the system, because not everybody knows it. And the fact is that we've been around since December of 2001 as a certified neighborhood council down in San Pedro. Others have been around for almost as long as that. And from the beginning of our existence, elections have been somewhat controversial in different places and different times. We've tried lots of different methods, and it's certainly been a learning experience. At the very beginning, we basically ran our own elections, and we did so without funding from the city. Later on, there were various additions to this, created election procedures. This was a little cumbersome, but they eventually came up with an online system, which is basically click on the right buttons, and this really improved the situation. But there's always a certain amount of controversy in an election where somebody wins and somebody loses, and there were continuing complaints by people who had not won. And eventually Dunn and the city fathers came up with a concept of what they called the independent election administrator, and that was someone who was not a member of our neighborhood council who got paid a modest amount of money and came down and basically oversaw the election, made sure that the ballots were properly given out, that they were put into the ballot box, that they were counted, and so on. And so the IEA, as we called that person, was essentially in charge of the mechanics of the election day itself and a few other things such as certifying candidacies and overseeing the checking of IDs. So for most of us that actually worked pretty well, but again it continued to be at issue, and a lot of that had to do with neighborhood councils that either didn't hold an election or perhaps did outreach that some of the candidates felt was not proper or not enough or whatever. Eventually, out of the Neighborhood Council Review Commission, there was a suggestion that it be handed over to the city clerk. Some of us thought that that was sort of the end of the discussion and it was going to go on like that, but there's again, it remained and remains controversial. Some of the history of that may come up tonight in your questioning, but I don't want to go into it in great detail. So we then had the fun of going to the councilman's town hall meetings and got a chance to talk about all kinds of things. And one of the things that came up was that the elections really didn't seem to have gotten better. They seem to have gotten worse. I suspect that a lot of it has to do with the fact that when you hire the city clerk, it's an expensive undertaking, and for the amount of money that they had, and with the city in a real financial crisis, they had to cut it back, and basically what they did for the most part was what an IEA did in the old days on election day, run the election, collect the ballots, and so on. On the other hand, what we used to do for $800 or $900 an election cost an awful lot more, which Mr. Eberhardt will have more to talk about. So there were other concerns, and whether or not the city clerk continues to run all of our elections or steps out of it entirely, or there's some sort of compromise intermediate, there nevertheless are issues that we wanted to talk about as neighborhood council participants. So out of this, we adopted a method which we call the task force, and I wanted to explain just a little bit about it so that everybody will understand what a task force is. And I'm going to look over and say thanks to Commissioner John Kim, who is basically, I would say, the father or grandfather of this concept, because it began about, I think, 15 or 16 months ago at a Board of Neighborhood Commissioners meeting where he hosted a town hall on bylaws. Now, bylaws have been another issue because city agencies look at neighborhood council bylaws and city attorney or Dunn has to look at some question, and so they go to the bylaws and they find now 93 different sets of bylaws, and they're all different, they're in different order. How do you find the rule for replacing a vacant board member if you don't have some sort of standardization? So we put together what we called a task force, and I'll point out that we were sort of told that we needed to keep a kind of distance from the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners for legal reasons, and I would point out that both sides, I believe, were very careful to obey the law and to maintain a proper distance so that we didn't get into Brown Act issues. So we were invited essentially to convene our own group, and the method that we chose, almost for lack of better than anything else, I just called y'all come. Everyone was invited, any neighborhood council stakeholder, which is to say any resident of the city of Los Angeles, could come, could participate, could vote. But the thing that actually makes this system work, in my view, is that we also had representatives from city agencies. We had representatives from the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners, of which I see at least 3 at the table who participated in the original task force, which was on bylaws. We also had a member of the city attorney's office. We had the general manager and staffers from Dunn, and so on. And we had people from, I think, 40 or 50 neighborhood councils over the course of the operation. The virtue of this kind of a system is that whatever this task force comes up with, you get buy-in at the grassroots stakeholder level. It's no longer a matter of a city agency imposing a solution that we had very little say in, or maybe 3 minutes at the microphone. It's something that was worked out by mutual negotiation. So without beating this one to death, we chose that same method for what we called the elections task force. The way we carried it out was beginning with a motion at a local regional association in the Harbor Association Neighborhood Councils, which asked for an elections task force and sent it to the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition, which is the citywide association of neighborhood councils, of which Mr. Schaefer is the chair and I'm the vice chair. And the LANC, as we call it, then agreed, let's have an elections task force. We had a really impressive group of people at that first meeting, including representatives from the mayor, the councilman, Dunn, the city clerk herself was there and spoke to us, and so on. Is anybody I left out? And out of that, we have spoken for about 4 meetings, and we've come up with an initial report which basically says if we can get some things done by the city council, then we intend to proceed and continue to negotiate and come up with a system that we think will really work. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Epperhart.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Doug Epperhart, Coastal San Pedro Neighborhood Council, and I am the author of this report, which basically means I took the words of all of the participants in the 4 task force meetings and put them in some logical order on paper. Bob gave you an idea of how we operated. Councilman Krikorian has already essentially stated the 3 sorts of objectives, desired outcomes that we looked at, which were more candidates running for neighborhood council boards, more voters voting for those candidates, and of course something that would be cost effective and save the city money at a time when that is probably the most critical thing. In going through this process, we looked at some criteria to establish tests against which we would make these recommendations. The first being flexibility. Many neighborhood councils had previously done elections every year. Some elected their entire board every year, 1-year terms. Some of them elected half their board every year to a 2-year term so that they were able to alternate without having extremely lengthy terms. And, there are a whole raft of other things that we lost in terms of our flexibility to conduct elections when the city clerk took over. Integrity. We understand that elections have to be fair and transparent. They have to be inclusive. We have to be welcoming of candidates and voters as much as possible. Viability. We have to have elections that are viable, that are not overly expensive, that are not overly complicated, that, again, transparency, inclusivity, leading hopefully to the desired outcome of diverse neighborhood council boards and volunteers working with those neighborhood councils. And finally, democracy. And this is something I think we sometimes miss as we work on neighborhood council issues. I understand the desire of bureaucrats to be able to put things into rule books that they can just pull off the shelf and give you the answer for. But that really is not what neighborhood councils are about. If you look to the charter, for instance, to the original intent of the framers, some of whom are here, neighborhood councils were not meant to be defined by a single definition. Maybe there's half a dozen definitions. And really that should be up to individual councils. And I think that we also looked at, the idea that one size does not fit all and should not fit all in this city. We then examined a number of different options, starting with the current system. We looked at e-voting, an electronic platform, e-voting with additional enhancements such as providing polling places for those folks who are not comfortable with e-voting, the independent election administrator model that we had used previously, the town hall model that my neighborhood council used essentially in its first 3 elections before we ever had any funding from the city, where we'd have an election on a Saturday in a park and get 600 people showing up to vote. I would love to see that because that was the best result we ever had. And then finally, one of the later things that came up, and that was the idea of suspending or postponing elections to save money. I can tell you, I brought this up at the Harbor Alliance of Neighborhood Councils, which is 8 neighborhood councils essentially covering all of CD 15. And I no sooner got the sentence out of my mouth, what do you think about postponing elections? And I got a chorus of no's. And I said, okay, we don't even need to vote on it then. So, and I think you would find that same result throughout the city, that neighborhood councils as democratic institutions in this city are important, and our ability to hold elections is just as important as any other elected body in our local government. So, the task force essentially came out with 4 recommendations. The first is that we need to deal with the current ordinance giving the city clerk authority to conduct elections. I have seen, as recently as yesterday in the CAO's report, a city attorney opinion that only the city clerk can conduct these elections. I am not sure about that. Perhaps the city attorney who's here can enlighten us on that. But we really need to be able to do something about that ordinance so that we can have the flexibility we need to conduct elections. We also looked at electronic voting as a model. The idea was that if it could be done for a certain cost, we would be very interested in it. The group likes the idea. Honestly, I don't believe at this point that it is a viable alternative because of cost, but perhaps we can go forward with some group of councils doing something like this as a pilot project. We might want to think about that. Outreach. Outreach was a huge component. Every person at the task force who talked about this, and there were several dozen, made it a point to say we have to have in every election that we do some outreach component. Doing elections, performing elections in a vacuum, in essence, by not having outreach, by not making the effort to recruit, by not making the effort to turn out voters, just results in very poor turnout. and we have to do something about that. And finally, there's the matter of election challenges. There have been various ways of dealing with these. Fortunately, we do not have a lot. I believe there were about a dozen in the last round of elections, all of which were dealt with, I think, satisfactorily. The group felt that we would like to have an outside method for dealing with this. Not neighborhood council people, not Dunn, not Bonk, not the city clerk, but some exterior entity that would truly be objective and seen as legitimate and credible by all sides. Some group that, some individual, some group that doesn't have an axe to grind in terms of how these things are determined. That really is about it. I think probably the two critical things are dealing with the ordinance that exists and following on that, allowing neighborhood councils that have experience, that have capability, that have competence to conduct elections within the next few years. That, I think, is the crux of it. To be able to bring the system back to its grassroots nature and move as much as possible away from the sort of bureaucracy of our elections. Lynn?
Good evening, Leonard Schaefer, Tarzana Neighborhood Council, Chair of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition. Very, very briefly, if anyone wants the history of what happened at the 9/12 Commission, the NCRC, to bring elections to the city clerk, I'll be happy to give it. I know Mr. Kim was there, but I'm not sure he was there for that portion of it. He was, okay. I can say that it was never the intention of the NCRC to stop neighborhood councils from having elections by doing this. Having looked at a certain portion of the CAO's report to Budget and Finance, I would have to say, yeah, the ultimate in saving money on elections is to say no elections. But it has been pointed out that's very anti-democratic, and it also breaks a promise to the people, to the stakeholders that board members represent, the ones that actually elected them and asked them to look at things and to bring things before the city and before commissions and committees. We suspended elections one time in order to get them into a rhythm, a 2-year rhythm, which many of us were not unhappy with, but we accepted. To do that again means that some of our board members are going to drop by the wayside. At a meeting last night, at our board meeting, one of the newly elected board members asked that question about, you mean that we would remain, and perhaps some of them don't want to. And then, of course, we get into an appointment process, and as has been said by someone else here tonight earlier, that means that it's the board members that are now forming who's on the board or who's governing the neighborhood council, rather than those who are being represented, and that may not be a good thing. I know that the city attorney disagrees with me, but I question whether or not the mere suspension of funding should prevent neighborhood councils from going forward under Section 904F of the Charter. That's how we originally ran our elections when we didn't have funding. I know at our last elections, we were, not the ones before the city clerk, we were regional members of CD3's neighborhood councils got together for our own outreach with a certain amount of money from Dunn to help us, but we didn't have a large amount of funding. We had a fairly successful election. So the question that I would pose, both to the commission and to the committee, is even if there were to be no specific funding for neighborhood councils, should neighborhood councils be told you may not, consistent with the charter, conduct your own elections with your own funds, perhaps by an IEA, perhaps by a town hall, or some other method, so long as it conforms to the charter. And that's the question.
Before I go to other questions, just a clarification on that point, Mr. Schaefer. Then, essentially, what you're suggesting is that even if there were to be a suspension, election holiday, whatever we want to call it, of the city clerk administered elections, that fact alone, you would contend, would not preclude the election process from going forward in some other format. For example, a neighborhood council deciding to administer its own election. Right?
That would be my contention.
So we're going to hear from from both the city attorney and the CAO in a bit, but I just want to make sure that we're clear on that point, because I think that the point that I think Mr. Eberhardt made was, if there were to be such a suspension, it would essentially be an abrogation of the democratic process of neighborhood councils. It isn't necessarily the case as long as some form of election could go forward, even if it's not a city clerk administered election. Fair to say?
Fair to say.
Okay. All right. Why don't we, I want to hear from Mr. Kim, from the CAO, and from the city attorney, but before we go to that, I'd like to open it up for questions from Mr. Zine or from the commissioners, if there are any on the initial report.
Just to get the comments narrowed down, the sentiment is you want the elections on a basis that is more informal than formal, fair, democratic, not with the city clerk, and save dollars getting it done. If that's a capsule view of what the direction is.
So it's on the record, I would have to say that's absolutely correct.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
And for the sake of the record, Mr. Zine, I'd say that's been a pretty fair summary of what you've been contending for at least the last year, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it? So, all right, thank you for that.
I know that city clerk is here in chambers. I don't want to show any disrespect to the city clerk. They run municipal elections. They have a system that must follow. There's challenges, and there's court, and there's litigations and all that. They're geared to do it in a specific fashion, so I don't want to show any disrespect to them. Neighborhood councils, rather informal, the Brown Act and all the other regimentation you have to follow. So I appreciate what they have to do, but sometimes it's a hindrance to what we're trying to do with the neighborhood councils to get the message across and to get people involved.
Yeah, brief comment. There was absolutely no problem with the way the city clerk ran the elections on the election day. We all found it to be very proper and very professional. I think the issue has to do with the fact that neighborhood councils have a couple of additional demands on us, and one is outreach, another is candidate recruitment, a third is to explain to people in our areas that neighborhood councils actually exist. This is not something that's traditionally the responsibility of a city clerk or a county recorder. And so when the city ran into financial trouble and cut the budgeting for the city clerks running the election way down, that basically cost us the outreach component and so on. We're used to running elections in the old days and basically on a box of donuts and a pot of coffee and a lot of volunteer, but that does not mean that we think that it's easy or soft or anything like that. Most of us, I think, ran elections in a very taut and tight manner, and we always made sure that we had support either from the League of Women Voters or from Dunn, and a very carefully drawn up set of election procedures.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for starters for questions from any of the commissioners who'd like to weigh in at this point. Comments, questions?
Under the scenario that you identified where neighborhood councils could conceivably administer their own elections, would you then imagine that all 93 would, one, and then two, what do you foresee would be the process around the challenges that might arise?
Okay, I'll take that one. One of the things that has happened in the last year is that because the department has been sort of decimated, they have so few people left to do anything, they have done a very good job of engaging with a lot of people in the neighborhood council system who have experience. We have created a bylaws resource team that works as a peer-to-peer group with neighborhood councils all over the city, many of whom aren't well-versed in these sorts of things. We are now moving toward the final stages of creating and implementing a peer mentor and training group that would do the same thing. I would anticipate that in order to help those neighborhood councils that are not particularly capable of conducting elections, we will probably end up with an elections resource team that will consist of a lot of folks who've had a lot of experience in terms of doing this kind of thing. And so that's something that I would see going forward. In terms of challenges, it's interesting. I looked at the NCRC recommendations, and they have a recommendation that deals with election challenges. It's fairly detailed and specific. The bylaws task force created a whole system for dealing with grievances as well as things like election challenges. I know there were some other efforts in the past. We have any number of models. The city clerk has suggested, for instance, hiring arbiters at a cost of, I believe, $15,500. That's pretty minimal for dealing with, bringing in an objective third party. So these are the types of things that I think we'll be looking at and talking about going forward.
Just one more question. So given some of the challenges that have been involved with outreach and engagement, and in many neighborhood councils have been struggling with really outreaching to the diversity of the community that they represent. Under your scenario, do you see any kind of resource competition between what neighborhood councils need to do to really engage, as well as the process of taking on this operational function, right, of quote-unquote running the election? So I see the grassroots effort around the education, the outreach, the engagement, versus the operational aspect of election. So do you see that there might be some, and as you think about, I want you to respond to that, thinking about all 93 neighborhood councils, not just about the highly functioning, highly resourced neighborhood councils. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I've got both guys here who want to talk about it, but I'll give you a very brief thing. Having been in this system as a board member now for more than 9 years, having worked on the bylaws resource team, having worked with other neighborhood councils informally in terms of training them in things like Robert's Rules, for instance, there's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of willingness to help that doesn't cost the city anything, frankly. We buy our own lunches even. I think that we are on the right path already to do those things. And Bangwan can probably give us a better idea of how many neighborhood councils of the 93 are competent to do something like this. I would guess that it's more than half. And then probably there are varying levels of ability beyond that. Ideally, what we'll do going forward here, if we get to start to work on this, is perhaps create 4 or 5 election templates that deal with the nuts and bolts, the administrative part of it. And then we can tack onto that the outreach component, which is really a sort of a separate thing and can be viewed in a broader context. And I know in our neighborhood council, we didn't do outreach and election outreach. We did outreach, and elections were folded into that. And that ideally is where this becomes a training tool for less capable neighborhood councils, so that they understand outreach isn't just something that you do for your election, but it's something you can do throughout the year. Okay, Lynn and Bob, I guess.
Okay. As chair of the two task forces that have existed so far, one of the things I've discovered is that we're good at taking advice. So when the city clerk brought in a suggestion that election challenges be handled by an independent arbiter system, even if we didn't know quite how to pronounce the word arbiter, we thought that's a great idea. It was essentially without debate, and we've accepted that as one of the principles. Now, the details of how that will be carried out, I think, need to be worked through. And again, one of the reasons we didn't continue to work through them is that everything critically depends on whether we are going to be participating in our own elections at any level, or whether the current status quo is maintained, whatever the price may be. I'd simply like to point out, kind of seconding what Doug said, outreach is something that we felt was very critical from the very beginning. We did it before there was city money at some level, because honestly in the harbor area we had a lot of public newspapers and so on that were interested enough in covering what we did. But after that, we were spending, probably 10% of our budget on direct outreach, taking out ads, putting up posters, all that sort of stuff. And eventually we took to publishing our own newspaper, which cost a bit more money, but turns out to be very effective. So the outreach part is certainly something that can be part of an election council budget, unless the city decides to cut it way, way back.
If I may, Commissioner Davis, unfortunately under the current system there are a few neighborhood councils that were unable to even conduct elections this year. And one of the things that I see is that, with all due respect to other agencies, they are not geared towards aiding that type of organization to move forward, to get candidates to engage. I believe that neighborhood council volunteers, those of us who spend our weekends at various meetings and our evenings coming down to City Hall to talk to people, are more able to help counsel those neighborhood councils that have those problems. Maybe not immediate. It may take a period of time. You have to build up a certain amount of trust, a certain amount of rapport, a certain amount of understanding in both directions as to why the problems are there. And I believe that neighborhood councils have the volunteers and the expertise and the desire to engage in that type of activity, because it is to our benefit to do so, to strengthen the system throughout the city.
Councilman.
Thank you. We're going to go.
I think you guys have done a great job, excellent work, a lot of good creative thinking, and it's a great springboard for more creative thinking down the line. I just want to set the stage that the one thing that has impressed me over the last year or so in getting reports from the city clerk and other departments is the absolute huge complexity of 1,700 candidates, 93 different neighborhood councils with a multitude of different types of descriptions of seats, different type of description of ballots. And also we have to look really at the history here. The one has to raise the question, Mr. Epperhart, you said it appears to you that the number of challenges in the past election were relatively small. I think you said 12. But if memory serves me correctly, the reason that the Education and Neighborhood Committee and the City Council recommended that the administration of neighborhood councils voting be switched to the city clerk was because, from what I understand, the enormous number of challenges took up a huge amount of time and energy of that, and they felt that it would be better to have a standardized way of elections so that there would be a knowledge throughout the system that it would be done right, it would be done fair. Now, nothing's perfect. And I happen to have some issues with regard to the way the challenges, even those 12 were handled. I participated in 3 of them, so that's a large percentage. But I just want to make sure that if someone can speak to the history of why the administration of the elections were taken from the department when they had around 50 employees, now they got around 20. And my concern is whether or not the department is really able to serve in that function as an administrator of elections for 93 neighborhood councils.
If I may.
Well, and we're going to have Mr. Kim comment on that shortly, but Mr. Schaefer, if you want to comment briefly, and then we
very briefly,
Commissioner Kim for a question.
Commissioner Abrams, without going into some thoughts, there was always a difficulty with regards to the administration of the elections due to changing views with regards to what should be the form of the process based upon even the standard election procedures that had been adopted. And employees at Dunn spent an inordinate amount of time working on elections. The NCRC, specifically speaking with Rafe Sonnenschein, who was our executive director, opined that there has to be some way to free up Dunn for other activities for the fostering of the system. So the idea came up to allow the city clerk to handle the elections, even though it would be only every 2 years, as Mr. Martinez pointed out to us, the then city clerk. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Sonnenschein once opined that it was the linchpin of the NCRC recommendations that the city clerk take them over to free up Dunn from this responsibility and allow them to work within the system, to foster the system, to basically be the cheerleaders for the system. That is where it arose, and it was passed on as one of the recommendations to the NCRC, and it was adopted from the NCRC, excuse me, it's passed on to the City Council, and was adopted then by the City Council by resolution as part of some of the recommendations. That's what brought it about.
Thank you.
Thank you. And before we go to Commissioner Kim, there's a lot of public comment cards that have been provided already. If anybody would like to comment upon this issue or any other issue within the jurisdiction of this committee, please bring a card forward. This will not be your only opportunity. We're going to continue this dialogue at the blog page that we have, cd2policy.blogspot.com. That is my policy blog, so you can provide comment there, and the documents relating to this hearing will be available on that web page as well. Commissioner Kim.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Krikorian. So I always appreciate hearing from the three wise men on any issue regarding the NC system. Usually I also hear from Ivan Spiegel, who may be in the audience or not. But I appreciated the report from the task force, and I particularly appreciated the fact that it started with these criteria, and it's similar to the way that we started, I think, the final document from the bylaws task force, that in some ways plays a double role as a sort of a set of values that we might really focus in on. And the only thing that I would possibly add as a suggestion is that we might add a fifth criteria about diversity, and to specifically lift that up and to specifically call that out around diversity, both in terms of the candidates, those involved in terms of the election, as well as those who are part of any resource team that's available to the rest of the system. And so in all areas in around elections that we might consider the word or the value of diversity. The other comment that I've made a couple of times now is that I worry about, let me start it this way. I'm glad that we're starting this focus on elections early on relatively to the next election. I worry that this will take up too much of our time for too long, and that we will again have a situation where the tail will be wagging the dog. There is a process of engagement and outreach, and an election is supposed to foster that. And if we focus too much time on the election itself and not enough time on what really needs to happen, where more people get involved, then we're really going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. And unfortunately, I believe that's what happened last time. The final results, the final tally of the number of votes were somewhat dismal around the system, and we had, I thought, a very robust capacity to administer an election for what was not yet a robust audience or universe of people to engage. So I'd like us to button down as quickly as possible this question about elections so we can get onto the real work of ensuring that people in our communities know about this election, know how to get involved, so on and so forth. Because, you know, the fact that we paid money for an election but not money for the outreach last time absolutely killed me. And so we really need to do whatever we can to avoid that this time around.
Okay. Thank you.
Two quick comments, if I may.
Please.
Diversity is a desired outcome. That has always been at the back of our minds and everything, and that's where we're aiming. The second thing is, in terms of the amount of time spent on elections, I see one big difference in the system between then and now, and that's the fact that neighborhood councils have come to realize that we are not alone. In other words, Coastal San Pedro now engages with the other neighborhood councils in the harbor area, and we're seeing that happen throughout the city in the development of regional organizations, that it's not us and done. It's us, all of the other councils around us, and that, I think, will make a very big difference.
Thank you. Commissioner Lux.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your report. Sitting on a neighborhood council that had the third highest voter turnout this last time, over 1,200 people, happened because the city clerk was able to run the elections, freeing us from being in the election business so that we could focus our time and money on candidate recruitment, which we did. We had 39 candidates, and we elected 21 with over 1,200, 1,215, I think. And the only reason that happened is because our energy and our time went into the outreach, and our money went into the outreach. There were no grievances on our election. It was extremely well run. Everything that I've heard in terms of people wanting the city clerk not to run the elections had nothing to do with the manner they ran them. Everyone agrees they did a good job in terms of structurally. The complaints that I hear are solely on the lack of being able to have ultimate authority about when and where the elections took place. Individual neighbor councils, including mine, wanted it a different day at a different location and didn't have that authority, so we're not happy with not having that power, basically, to choose it. But other than that, most of the comments I've heard across the city were that they were glad that they were run properly, as evidenced by only 12 grievances. I had a few problems with the grievances myself, but overall it was way less than before. But my question, I have two questions. Since the city clerk now has the legal authority for all elections in LA, and since they now supervise the very complex nature of 93 neighborhood council elections, which, as I said, most thought were handled well, what would be the advantage of stripping the city clerk of that legal authority? And if it was stripped, who would get the legal authority done with a very diminished staff? So who would be the ultimate authority? That is my question. And it would see, so I'd like an answer to that question, and I'd like to see the outcome in terms of who voted. There was a dismal overall outcome, but the ones that had high vote getters, voter turnout like ours, which is a very contentious community, and there have been many grievances in the past, what did they do in terms of outreach to get those numbers? So anyway, back to my initial question, who would you see as the ones having legal authority if the city clerk, who's in the business of running elections, didn't have it?
Well, Commissioner, if the city clerk was no longer in it, then I believe that 901D of the charter would come back into play, and that says that Dunn shall assist neighborhood councils in the election or selection of their officers.
Dunn has 15 now employees? 19, 15?
I think that would be the legal authority. Mm-hmm. As to how much they would do, that's another question.
Okay. Anyway, that's my concern. I just think the city clerk complaints about it was not the professional job they did. In my mind, we went from being adolescents to young adults. and were given a lot more credibility as neighborhood councils because we ran professional elections. And that, to me, means a lot.
I think sorry.
Please.
I think the Harbor has always run professional elections, whether they were run by volunteers or by IEAs. IEAs certainly are professionals and were very well trained. I think the big difference, with all due respect, is that Venice made a lot of effort and spent its own money to do outreach, and I think you're selling yourself short if you're going to say that you couldn't have also run an election with an IEA and, without war breaking out. It just strikes me as a bit far-fetched. I think you probably did a good job. The real difference is the $3 million overall that it would cost to do this in a way that volunteers and Dunn could do it for about maybe 1/7 that amount of money.
I understand the financial concern. I have one other question. How many people voted in your elections?
Very few.
How many?
4.
How many?
I will tell you that coastal San Pedro was the flip side of Venice. There were 4 neighborhood councils who had in excess of 1,000 votes in 2010. The median number was 126
And
votes.
how many were in yours?
We had 34. That's the lowest we have ever had. We had 13 candidates running for 17 positions and 34 voters. A big part of that was the fact that it was on a Tuesday afternoon when we had always run our elections on a Saturday and tried to have at least 8 hours available for people to vote. I can tell you the best one we did was before we even had IEAs. We had 602 people voting for 54 candidates running for 17 seats.
And Mr. Gelfand, how many voted in your election?
I happen to be in the same neighborhood council as Mr. Epperhart.
We're both.
Yes.
As I recall, it was something under 300. Unfortunately, we have
I'm
rather...
just curious.
We don't have quite as colorful a community as your neighborhood council.
I don't think it's colorful as much as putting time and money and attention into getting people out.
But one of our problems may also have been the location of our election, because while we had suggested one location, it was not there, and the location where it was, very truthfully, 1/2 of our community doesn't even know that location exists.
Okay, well, let's not get mired in the details of 93 neighborhood council elections. I think that the point is well taken, though, that there is variation among the 93 communities, and there's variation in their needs, in their abilities as well. And I certainly have heard from many that having a city clerk administrated election does provide a degree of credibility and does provide the kind of liberty that you're talking about to do outreach. But of course there's a direct correlation between the cost of the administration of the election and the availability of resources to do outreach too. And that's at the exact vortex that of this issue that we're trying to resolve. Commissioner Gadiga? Okay, all right. So then what I'd like to do next is I think I'd like to turn next to Mr. Kim and ask if you have comments that you'd like to make in response to the report, and particularly to Chairman Abrams' question about the resources that Dunn has available to take up the cudgel on this. And then I'd also like to hear comments from the City Attorney and the CAO as well. So, Mr. Kim.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. Bongwan Kim, General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. And firstly, I wanted to start by complimenting you on the process for this meeting. The neighborhood councils are the ones who have to live with the results of this decision around elections. And I think it's very appropriate that the elections task force is making the report to you rather than a city department making the report to you, because as has been stated by members of the task force, they have lived with this system much longer than any of us have. And they are experts in their own right, and we should be doing as much as we can to pay attention to their expertise, because they have to live with it at the grassroots level. Also, a word about process and partnerships. The way that our department has shifted with diminished resources, I think, has dramatically increased and actually fundamentally changed our relationship with neighborhood councils. The involvement of neighborhood councils in the deliberation process is very critical to coming up not only with a quality decision, but also with results that neighborhood councils can champion in their own right. It seems to me that if we don't have neighborhood councils feeling like they have a part in the decision-making and know that the city is facilitating processes by which they had a part in designing, that it's going to be that much more difficult for them to do their job. So our department has very much been approaching solutions to systemic issues in a partnership model. Myself, I've been focusing in the areas where the commission, neighborhood council leadership, and the department can agree that this is a direction that we want to go in. So I'm not even bothering to focus on the areas where we disagree because we don't have the resources for it. The quick answer to the question about resources is that we couldn't do anything without elections, without additional staff. What kind of additional staff resources we would request would depend on the direction that the council provides to the department. My thinking on this has really evolved from the time that I actually served on the Neighborhood Council Review Commission, and when we talked about elections, my first question is, why do we have to have an election system for a grassroots system? Isn't there a simpler way to get people into these board seats? And sure enough, I'm sitting here 4 years after the fact, and I'm convinced that there are alternative ways that we can do it that reflects what we're trying to do here. Another thought is that I think we really have to return to the basics here. It seems to me that city government does tend to complicate things. And with the neighborhood councils, we have to return to what are the two primary purposes for the neighborhood councils as established in the charter. They are to get more people to care about what goes on in city government, and then two, for government to be more responsive to a larger constituency of people who are telling them what the needs of the local community are. How do elections fit into that, those two primary purposes? And it seems to me that outreach, we have to talk about outreach at the same time that we talk about elections. And that if we can think about elections as a system, or in your words, Councilman, a movement-building opportunity. Every 2 years, everybody hears about neighborhood council elections. And that is what I proposed to you when, in a prior Education Neighborhoods Committee, that were the city clerk to conduct elections, that we would be provided resources to launch a citywide campaign. What are neighborhood councils? Why do they matter to you? And how can you get involved through the 93 neighborhood councils available to your city? So I think that if we can keep those kind of guiding principles in mind, that we will come out with a much better solution. I think it's more than appropriate that we take careful opportunity to examine what are the opportunities here. And even though we are in the worst fiscal crisis in a generation, I do believe that we do have a strategic opportunity to do this right this time, to develop an election system that is reflective of the principle and spirit of the neighborhood council system.
Thank you.
Just on that note, I happen to agree with you that we do have an extraordinary opportunity now to take some time to look at the models that are available to us, that are practical, that are real, that can be done within a certain amount of financial wherewithal. The real question is, for me, who's going to have that leadership of looking at all the different models, who has the experience to look at the different models and vet them going forward over 6 months, 9 months, or a year. And that's the real question that I have. It goes to, I think, to what Commissioner Lux's question is. If we strip away the legal authority from the city clerk, which has staff, which is in the business of elections as well as a million other things, but this is something they do well, where would that authority go to if we're looking now to potentially lead a way to look at different potential models that could work better for this system? I think that's the real nut of the question, is who is going to have the authority to do that job? So at the end of the day, when suggestions or recommendations are made, we say it was vetted well. And it can't be done, in my opinion, without neighborhood council involvement at some level.
Thank you. Now, there were a number of questions on this issue of authority from the commissioners, and so if we could, Mr. Martinez, what thoughts does the city attorney have on the report and on the proposals to change the clerk's current authority to administer elections?
Yes, briefly by way of background, I think initially this is really largely a policy decision. It's going to be a decision on what you as the policymakers decide in terms of who should conduct the election. There's a mechanism to be able to get to whatever result you ultimately would like to achieve, and if it is, or if there is an alteration from the city clerk currently conducting the elections, then there will need to be changes made to the administrative code and plan. Just a little history that I wanted to interject in this item. Under the charter, the department was initially charged with assisting neighborhood councils with the selection or election of their neighborhood council boards. There was a distinction then that was created between an election versus an election process. Neighborhood councils have, and have continued to have, authority over selecting their neighborhood council board members. It was only that portion that dealt with elections that was transferred from the department to the city clerk, and that's what the city clerk has authority over and runs. So, for example, there's been other elections that have happened, I'm sorry, I don't want to use that word, other selection processes that have happened where, for example, neighborhood councils had members show up at a town hall. It was close to an election, not quite there though. There wasn't a lot of similarities with it. People had open, they raised their hand in order to indicate who they were voting for. It had occurred at an open meeting, so it was much more akin to a selection process. So those types of procedures have still and are remain within the neighborhood councils. There's no requirement that they are required to have either. It's their choice. They may choose to have a selection or election process. The problem that we're dealing with is with respect to neighborhood councils that want this election process or procedure, who is the entity then that will be required or ultimately have authority over the elections? I don't know that I was necessarily understanding Mr. Schaefer's comment with respect to that we may have a disagreement with the issue. I certainly think that if there's an ability to modify the ordinance, we can change who the current authority exists. We may also have some other issues with respect to transferring these duties back to the department, but I would assume if we're going to change it from the city clerk, that it would likely end up back with the department, so that the department also has some ability to enter into some contracts or something if we do go down that route.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I want to make sure I understand the legal framework of this. Now, what I understood you to say is that some selection process at the discretion of the neighborhood councils could be adopted, including a caucus kind of a situation, that if they chose to do that. But your concern is that those neighborhood councils who prefer to have an administered election need to have some structure in place to ensure that that election is operated in a fair and transparent way. Is that a good summary?
Well, I would say that the city has created that structure for those neighborhood councils that want to have the election process, because there was a concern with neighborhood councils early on when they were conducting elections that we ultimately lead to more regulations and guidance for those conducting elections.
Currently, that's the case.
Yes.
But if a policy decision were made to remove election administration authority from the clerk, individual neighborhood councils would still be left with the option of adopting a caucus scenario, an internal election scenario, whatever. They would have the authority to be able to do that. But in any election process, or for that matter, even any selection process, there has to be some arbiter who resolves disputes and ensures the integrity of the system. There has to, in order for it to really be a legitimate selection process, you have to have some independent authority to do that. Now that could it not be, that could also be something that's decided upon by the individual neighborhood council. They could hire an independent election administrator. They could use Lank or Vank or Bonk or somebody else as a final arbiter of disputes. Could they not?
There's any number of creative processes or procedures that you could come up with any of these systems. The neighborhood councils do have that freedom to come up with the selection process or an election process. While it's not necessarily a legal issue that there has to be some type of arbiter or decision maker, I think that there are good practical decisions for one. It's largely more an issue of avoiding the disputes and problems that stem from having elections. Why you have clear procedures, why you have somebody that resolves these disputes when they arise.
It's an issue of the legitimacy of the process, not so much of the legal framework that we're already in.
Correct.
Okay, Mr. Kim.
I just wanted to clarify the way that we are approaching the selection process is in the narrow case of newly certified neighborhood councils where they have an interim body upon the certification by the commission, and then we've designed a selection process for the seating of the permanent board. The way we've done it is to write the selection process in their bylaws so that is the document by which they're being held publicly accountable for the selection process. We provide assistance to the neighborhood council to organize themselves, as well as introducing neighborhood council volunteers from the region. So I think there are some kernels for developing a selection system on a more citywide basis, but we would have to spend some time with the city attorney, with the neighborhood councils to try to develop a procedure where standing neighborhood councils could adopt that in a way that could stand up to public integrity.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to the CAO, Commissioner Kim, did you have a question?
I did, and this will have to be my last comment because I have to leave for my daughter's 4th birthday. I would want to note that we had an opportunity with some newly formed NCs to suggest that they make their bylaws appropriate to have a selection process, but it's by no means ubiquitous across the system that they have that there. So it would have to be something that we'd also have to revisit in terms of, do all the bylaws have something like this or something similar that we could leverage? And this may go back to the bylaws task force yet again, but it is something that may be uneven across the landscape.
Thank you, and happy birthday to your daughter. I'm sorry, Commissioner Davis.
Oh, yes. I have a cost question. Going back to your comparison table, because we don't have just plain bottom line numbers, could you give me a sense of what the cost differential would actually be between the e-voting and physical day of election with electronic voting tools and the IEA model, given that the city clerk is not the IEA?
Maybe I could address that. It's probably a bit premature to talk about costs at this point because these are very broad kind of numbers based on some general assumptions that were made by the task force. So the cost is obviously something that we would have to return to based upon council direction.
And there's some actually significant policy questions that would have to be answered that I don't think have been discussed here that I actually wanted to discuss about e-voting and vote by mail. Leading in that list is the fact that in order to do either system like that, don't you absolutely have to have pre-registration of voters for either e-voting or for vote by mail? Don't you have to have a clearer definition of what a stakeholder is, which probably pretty much eliminates the possibility of factual basis stakeholders? I mean, isn't that sort of inherent to those processes? And if you do that, that is going to have an implication certainly as far as cost and engagement as well. And I don't know if the task force looked at those issues or not.
Yeah, a couple of things. And let me, these are very ballpark numbers, but in the CAO's recommendations from Monday, there was a figure from December 2007 where Dunn had reported on the average cost of doing IEA elections at about $6,000 per neighborhood council. The average cost in 2010 for the 89 neighborhood councils that were conducted by the city clerk was not quite $13,000 per council, about $53 per vote. Beyond that, it gets very anecdotal. We heard a presentation from a vendor who talked about a electronic platform system without enhancements, by the way, such as separate polling place elections, and threw out a ballpark figure of about $450,000 based on 98 neighborhood council elections. These are all very tenuous numbers, but they're very ballpark.
And certainly the cost,
they give you an idea.
The cost of e-voting is going to be impacted dramatically by the degree of standardization among the elections. If you continue to allow 93 different ballot formats, then you're going to have an extraordinarily high cost compared to if the contractor has a minimal number of options in how a ballot is going to be formatted, then you're going to obviously have a much lower cost. But that, again, is a fundamental policy question, I think, about the degree to which neighborhood council, the process of elections, not the substance of what neighborhood councils do, but whether the process of administering the elections is going to be subject to any degree of standardization or at least reduction of options from what the status quo is.
We have a huge amount of work to do. And one other thing in terms of pre-registration, there have in the past, I don't know the story with the city clerk necessarily, but there were neighborhood councils in the past that required their stakeholders to register prior to the day of the election. And they had a roll of voters that they kept. So that has existed in the past. In a sense, pre-registration has always existed in that someone desiring to vote who walked up to the table and said, I'm a stakeholder, I want to vote. Okay, fill out this piece of paper with your name and your stakeholder status. So that has always existed as far as I know. So in some sense, you have always ended each neighborhood council election with a stack of papers with the voters' names and addresses and stakeholder status on them.
That's not pre-registration.
So so there's been some sort of
the reason for my questioning
Commissioner,
is that,
pull the mic down.
in your purpose and objectives, the last objective was identifying the most cost-effective method. And so there's a recommendation that's definitive in some sense when I think there needs to be more work on identifying whether or not, for example, the recommendation by the task force is the most cost-effective once you factor in customization, inclusiveness, etc. So that's, there's just for me a disconnect between the definitive nature of the recommendation and additional research that needs to be done to support that recommendation.
Yeah, nothing is written in stone.
Yeah. Okay.
Chairman Avers. Yeah, I've been moving in that direction. Thank you. So I'd like to hear now from the comments of the CAO's office, and in particular, among other things, Ms. Sauer, I'd like you to touch upon the timing issues surrounding this kind of a change in format and the legal framework of how these elections are going to be administered, and in particular how that affects the city's budget cycle. So if you can provide whatever comments that you'd like to provide in response, but specifically, if we make these sorts of changes now, what does that mean in terms of whether we can move forward with elections as scheduled?
Mr. Chairman, Theresa with the CAO's office. In general, we're just for the benefit of the committee and the task force, where we are right now is we are in the final stages of formulating the budget, the proposed budget for the mayor that's to be released on April 20th. One of the issues that this is the budget for fiscal year 2011-2012. I'm sorry, 2011-12.
Encompass the expenditures for the 2012 cycle of elections.
That is correct. As part of the proposed budgets, the city clerk did submit a budget request for conducting neighborhood council elections. The total cost of that package is around $2.9 million. That's the election piece is about 1.6, and then a full-blown outreach campaign is around $1.3 million. The challenge facing the city right now is twofold. We are looking at trying to close a budget gap of around $350 million. As part of the discussion for the current fiscal year and rolling into next year, the CAO's office released in conjunction with the mid-year report a series of white papers on options, policy decisions or policy options for the council to either defer costs or cost-cutting measures. One of the options that would be discussed by the Budget and Finance Committee on Monday as they take up the white papers or as we go forward would be potentially postponing the neighborhood council elections until 2014. Part of the rationale behind the recommendations for our office is, in part, the city's financial condition. Secondly, sort of where we are in the process. We're almost ready to come forward, or the mayor's office is almost ready to come forward with its budget. If there's a change in the way the neighborhood council elections are administered as proposed by the task force, there are clearly a number of policy decisions that need to change. You've referenced some of them, the way they would be conducted. Would it be a caucus vote? Would it be a town hall meeting? If you go to an electronic system, how are you going to deal with the stakeholder definitions? If you do go to an electronic system, you have a ballpark figure of 800,000, but we really don't know what that encompasses. So part of our recommendation was, with an abundance of caution, to perhaps postpone the elections, to have the clerk do a study on the various options for a system for neighborhood council elections. If the elections aren't conducted next year, then the clerk has staff available to do it at no additional cost. One of the other issues...
Before you move on to the other issues, just for clarification on that, the budget issues that you're talking about would not necessarily require postponement of the elections. What they would require postponement of is the city's support of the elections.
It would very well require, yes, you could have the election.
The neighborhood councils could still conduct, as we've discussed, they could still conduct an election process.
That is correct. However,
on schedule without the support of city clerk funding.
Correct, and that's really the issue at hand, is do you postpone the funding? There's been some discussion of the need for an ordinance change, and as referenced in our report, when the neighborhood council elections were transferred to the city clerk, as part of that, an ordinance was adopted by the council that provided them with the authority to conduct the elections. And so when we reference that, what we're really saying is those administrative changes need to be to transfer that authority or to amend that authority, because if the clerk isn't doing it, it as the city attorney has said, it would probably go back to the department to assist the neighborhood councils. But that's the reference to the ordinance change, because as it stands now, that's how authority was vested with the clerk. So at this point, we're kind of in a time crunch in terms of the financial piece of how this would move forward. So again, we're grappling with, the CAO's office, mayor's office, and council are grappling with how to deal with the funding given the city's competing priorities, and, you know, if there's going to be some new system in place, particularly if it's some electronic system, sufficient time to determine what that is, because in general, with a new system, it takes some time to have some vetting, to work out the bugs. This is probably not an off-the-shelf system, given the 93 different competing priorities. That's going to have an impact on the cost, and so that's kind of where we are at this point.
Okay, thank you. Now, I took you off course. You had a couple of other issues you wanted to cover.
Perfectly happy to be done. I don't even remember where I was at that point.
All right. Thank you. Commissioner Lux.
Yes, just a quick for the CAO. Thank you. It's my understanding, I like the idea of electronic voting, and I think eventually that's where we're going for the country. But I do know the Secretary of State of California prevented that from happening because the systems in place were not foolproof, to her credit. So my understanding is that electronic voting is not foolproof at this point in time, and it doesn't, also I've seen a study that says it does not increase public participation.
Okay, I will answer that question, but if something comes flying at the back, it'll be from the clerk telling me I've answered the wrong way.
Okay.
Yeah, I do understand that, as I understand it now, there are no electronic voting systems currently certified with the state, or touch screen, or those types of things. I can't speak to the second question about the level of public participation. I don't have those facts, but I do know that was an issue recently in ranked choice voting, as when that was considered by the council, and because of the lack of certified systems, the council chose not to move forward with ranked choice voting. Any other specific items, I would defer to the clerk, because I'm really not the subject matter expert.
So it sounds like study is definitely needed before
that much
we go that way, because we don't know enough. Okay.
Yeah. Certainly, the Secretary of State's top-to-bottom review of the electronic voting systems in California revealed tremendous concerns. And it was an issue that I dealt with in the state legislature to try to remedy, and there are tremendous concerns. But let me just ask on that point. The currently existing electronic voting systems all involve going to a polling place and voting with a touchscreen or some other system within the polling place. Did you give any thought to actually voting from home, electronically voting from home, so that by email or in some other way like that maybe is not as high tech as the whiz-bang national electronic voting contractors provide, but a more streamlined, simple system like that?
The short answer is that was in fact the essence of the presentation we heard, which was anybody with a home computer or telephone or access to a library that has computers would be able to vote under the proper conditions. And we spent a lot of time talking about security and how that would be handled, and how people might have to pre-register and actually have essentially a unique pass number. We also asked questions about, for example, well, suppose people don't really feel comfortable with that. They actually want to go to the equivalent of a polling place. Well, yes, you could set up a laptop computer at a polling place. You could conceivably pre-register people right there under the right circumstances and take their votes. All of this cost more money. So we thought that, as a general principle in the long run, where we may see like 10 times as many votes cast in a really robust system, this was something worth looking at, and that's why we said the preferable method would involve that. We didn't say that it was anything that could be done right now in a financial crisis. And honestly, I think that the concept was walked back a little bit in terms of the money, and we then concentrated on cutting back what the original proposal was by at least $500,000 and maybe more like $1 million.
If I may make one comment with regards to that, one of the advantages, and this is for Commissioner Lux, that I think some of us saw in the e-voting, the electronic voting, is that it could be conducted over a period of perhaps 5 to 7 days rather than on a single voting day, and it would not cost apparently any more to do so once it's set up. That would definitely increase participation.
And also the complexity of the system with the 93 different neighborhood councils and different bylaws was actually assumed in the original presentation, that they would have to be creating not only different ballots for each neighborhood council, but the equivalent of different balloting screens for different kinds of stakeholders in each neighborhood council. It's just a matter of programming.
I see our clerk approaching. Ms. Legman, did you want to make a comment on that? Please feel free. Come on up.
Good evening, members of the committee and members of the commission. I just wanted to pipe in on this discussion of e-voting, which is a very fascinating concept, and just wanted to say that I don't want to make this the only venue where the merits and disadvantages of e-voting are totally vetted out. It is a huge universe, a huge arena. I believe that the task force had the benefit of having one proposer show his product, but that is not to say that there are quite a number of proposers out there who should be given the chance to make their pitch. There should be a very studied analysis. It was brought up, the fact that the more customization per neighborhood council or region, the higher the cost is going to be. You get what you pay for. Another thing that hasn't been mentioned is the fact that the city clerk translates into the 6 federally mandated languages. Any translation of language, even one language, Spanish, not to mention 2, 3, or 4 others, is an additional and pretty hefty cost, according to the one vendor that was interviewed. So there are a huge array of other issues that need to be studied and solicited by the e-vending community, so to speak. And I just didn't want this to be the only place where its virtues, which a lot of, we may not know what they all are at this point in time, even the election, your election experts. So I just wanted to make that point.
I appreciate that point. Thank you. And this certainly will not be the only discussion that we have of it. And in fact, that is a good reminder that if you want to voice your e-opinion about e-voting or any other matter, remember, you have the option to do that at cd2policy.blogspot.com, which is our policy blog, which we continue to draw input from the community on these issues. Thank you very much for that reminder.
We'll hang back for any other questions you have.
You don't need to rush off in case there's other questions. One other question I had, and then I think if it's agreeable with the commissioners, I think we should move to public comment because we have a lot here. Was there any consideration within your task force about eligibility on the subject of greater involvement or impacts on involvement? Was there any discussion about eligibility changes, particularly with the factual basis stakeholders, number one? And number two, was there any consideration of changes to the requirement for documentation of such factual basis versus self-affirmation?
The short answer is a previous task force, the bylaws task force, discussed the question and was essentially unanimous, if I recall, in calling for removing the factual basis stakeholder as a citywide requirement. We discussed it a little bit more in the current task force, and we did not actually decide to take it up as a policy decision in a vote. I can say for myself that my thought is that if individual neighborhood councils would like to offer additional categories, such as the neighborhood council that adds people who board horses in their district as stakeholders, why not? That's the system. But the problem with imposing the factual basis stakeholder as a general function seems to be a problem. There's one additional issue which had to do with the original definition of stakeholder, which is anyone who lives, works, or owns property in the district. Certainly people in my neighborhood council have been calling for most of a decade for somebody, the bonk or the city council, to make some reasonable common sense definition of what it means, for example, to work in the district. Leave it at that. Clearly there's a history. At one time, at the very beginning of the system, Dunn said, no, you can't even ask for identification. Then they did a complete 180, and you had to ask for identification. So we sort of go with the flow.
All right. Thank you very much. Any last questions or comments from the commissioners?
I just want to make one last comment very quickly. As a neighborhood council board member myself for several years, I see the neighborhood council system as a family. We have our ups and downs, we have our ins and outs, but I just want to say how important it was for these issues to be brought to the table so that they can be examined in the light, an open light, and discussed. The good ones rise like good cream in the coffee, and the other ones, well, we'll deal with them on another day. So I just want to say that this experience, and I want to thank Councilmember Krikorian for making it happen, is one of the most important discussions and conversations we will have because of the way we hold dear as in our democracy what elections mean to us. So I just want to thank you folks for having taken the kind of the bull by the horns and moved forward with it.
Thank you. Commissioner Davis.
It's a process and timing question. So right now, elections would be held 2011, 2012. We're up against a budget so that, in essence, if the city clerk doesn't perform the elections, and if the jury is still out on whether or not electronic voting or IEA might be the most cost-effective, then that would mean that possibly in this upcoming budget there would be no funding for elections.
I can't speak specifically to the proposed budget because the mayor has not yet released it. There are a number of options if a decision is made, a policy decision is made to not have the clerk and suspend elections, or then it's possible funding would not be included. It's possible if this is still up in the air, then money might be allocated in the unappropriated balance pending resolution of this issue. It's possible that given the competing priorities, there might be no funding. I mean, there's a wide range of options.
That's what I'm trying to understand.
And none of those have been completely, those are still under consideration.
And the problem is that even though the elections are 18 months away, more than 18 months away, the decisions on these issues in order to secure funding for the administration of those elections need to be made right now.
Right, that's my process question. Okay.
So, if there is to be funding for those elections. I mean, and as we've discussed, if there's not, there are other ways that conceivably the elections could proceed, but not the status quo.
Yeah, and if I may, I want to thank you, Councilman Krikorian. This task force really came out of those few of us who attended your meeting back in December when we saw the numbers from the city clerk for the coming year and decided we need to do something about this. And I have to thank all of the folks who showed up at those task force meetings on Saturdays and Sundays, including, Irene from your office, folks from the mayor's office, and so on and so forth. Dunn certainly did an outstanding job in terms of working with us on this. They can't be complimented enough, particularly Bangwan, Gracie Lou, and Leila Campos. And with that, I would say we still have a lot of work ahead of us. I see the CAO had recommended that some sort of group be set up to start vetting these different ideas and looking at them. I would hope that the task force could continue to do this work and bring in a lot more people. We also have www.lanc.blogspot.com, where all of the documents, minutes, and considerations that we went through are online, and we'll continue to post things. So at that, I would say thank you again, and we look forward to keep working on this.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you for stepping up to the plate and doing this important work. It's time-consuming, difficult, taxing work, and I know that everyone in the Neighborhood Council movement and everyone in the city appreciates your willingness to take on the task. And there is plenty of work still ahead of us, but we've got a good start with these discussions, so I want to thank you very much. And let's move on to public comment. We've got a lot of speaker cards. If you haven't filled one out and would like to speak, please go ahead and fill out one of these and bring them up front. And we're going to... hold on a second. Okay, well, consistent with my past practice, I'm going to allow 2 minutes a speaker, but folks, there's probably 50 cards here. So if you don't need 2 minutes, I would appreciate it if, and everyone else would appreciate it who's following you, if we could keep it as tight as possible, or if somebody's already said what you wanted to say, just say me too, if you would, because otherwise we're all going to be here well past our dinner time. All right, so the first speaker is Ida Talela, followed by Judy Price.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I found the discussion very interesting. However, I'm not convinced that the shifts and changes are going to occur to serve community in the best way possible. Elections need to be fair and transparent. The bumps still remain. No delayed elections. We are tired of seeing dictatorships. If in the bylaws it states unlimited term limits, let that neighborhood council run its own elections at its own expense and serve itself and not use a dime of city money. In a time of cuts to communities and services, I say the monies are better spent on anti-graffiti programs, LAPD, Office of Community Beautification, Department of Public Works. Since the review came, the NCRC review commission worked, there are still glitches that have not been addressed. And while the task force really set into motion things, more work needs to be done. Under Dunn, if you send things back to neighborhood councils, I remember when I ran as a candidate in a neighborhood council election where there was a dead candidate, and Dunn's IEA approved that status. My challenge was thrown out. In 2010, my challenge to a district map, to the neighborhood council district map, was also thrown out. I object to poorly thought through challenges. Save your money and use it on other more important tasks. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Judy Price, followed by Lisa Sarkin.
Oh, thank you so much. I have to leave for a bylaws committee meeting. I'm Judy Price. I'm vice president of the Greater Valley Glen Council. I've also worked on our elections, procedures and bylaws for the last 5 elections. We recommend going back to the old days. We like the idea of the neighborhood council elections going back to Dunn and the neighborhood councils. Something I think that's important to point out is that Dunn and the neighborhood councils used to have yearly elections. So we spent most of our time on elections. Now it's every 2 years, which has made a big difference. It is unconscionable for the city to even consider postponing the elections for 2 years. We went through a 1-year postponement already, and our elections don't call for re-election of the officers every year. It's for a 2-year term, so that means that we're going to have the officers for 4 years. You know, it's also going to mean that we're going to lose board members because people aren't going to make that kind of commitment. It's simply not fair, and I think that we can do it for a lot less money with Dunn and neighborhood councils. One thing that I think is also important that's fallen through the cracks, outreach. Neighborhood councils have not had the same requirement in terms of outreach that it used to have with Dunn. The city clerk, one of the reasons that the NCRC wanted the city clerk to do the elections was for the legitimacy of getting a city clerk mailer for the elections. Well, guess what? That was taken away. So now, our neighborhood council, for example, didn't do any outreach. We had one of the lowest turnouts. Outreach, outreach, outreach. Require the neighborhood councils to spend more, and to spend more on the elections and for outreach. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Lisa Sarkin, followed by Theresa Marcus.
I agree with Judy, and we have to leave. It was a great job by the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sarkin. Next speaker is Theresa Marquez, followed by Mike O'Gara.
Hello, my name is Theresa Marcus. I'm from Boyle Heights. I'm the chair of the bylaw committee right now. And I've been in the neighborhood council for some years. So I've done everything from candidates to helping the election and so on. And I have to congratulate Dunn because they have done a tremendous change and support for the neighborhood councils. I feel that they're reachable now. And thank you, Mr. Kim. I think a lot of changes, and Gracie Liu, and now the city attorney, we feel that we are part of it now. You gave us some empowerment saying, okay, the city attorney is involved, Mr. Kim is involved. One of the things that we have in Boyle Heights is that we have 80,000 people or more that we have to cover. Most of the neighborhood councils carry about 25,000. We have to do outreach to 80,000, English and Spanish. And I really believe that Dunn should take over the elections because they're familiar with our neighborhood councils, with our territory, and with the people that we have to deal with and how we have to deal with them. And I urge you to please let Dunn, but also give them the money. We don't have, Boyle Heights Neighborhood Council has never had the money to be able to outreach to that many people. We had 126 people come to vote out of 80,000. Okay, so there's a failure there or mismanagement, I don't know, but we haven't been able to do the outreach. I think Don could help us now. I think they done a good job and they know how to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mike O'Gara, followed by Carrie Braisman. Okay, I don't see Mike. Carrie Braisman, followed by Charles Lindenblatt.
Sure. Councilmember, Commissioners, Carrie Braisman, an at-large representative on the Mid-City West Community Council, speaking personally. In the last election cycle, I participated in 3 neighborhood council elections, In 2 cases, between 400 and 500 people voted. In 1 case, over 1,000 people voted. All 3 elections operated efficiently with little doubt about the integrity of the process or the outcomes. I personally support continued operation of the elections by the city clerk. 3 points briefly. 1, we've talked a little bit about factual basis stakeholders. There was a little bit of inconsistency in communication in this election cycle about when you could challenge someone on the basis of their self-affirmation, and in some cases it was allowed, in some cases it was not allowed, and that's something that we should certainly make consistent and communicate consistently next time. This issue of pre-registration of voters, Greg Nelson has it right. It's a how does he call it? A solution in search of a problem. If we allow poll watching and election challenges, we don't need pre-registration of voters, although I suppose it comes back to the types of stakeholders we allow to vote. In many cases, pre-registration would be a barrier to participation and cause more confusion. There were people this time who didn't vote in my neighborhood council election because they thought they had to be a registered voter in our neighborhood council area. So if we make people registered to vote in neighborhood council elections and registered to vote in city elections, incredible potential for confusion and barrier to participation. On the issue of email voting or e-voting, one issue that I have not heard raised today is how it could be used by employers in particular who control lots of email addresses. In a case where there's a big employer in a neighborhood council district with hundreds of employees, they've got easy access to their folks and they could overwhelm the residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Charles Lindenblatt, followed by Cindy Cleghorn.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is, my name is Charles Lindenblatt. I am with the Mid-City West Community Council. I'm the secretary there. I was the election committee chair for the last couple of cycles. Currently, bylaws grievance committee chair, and I'm speaking on my own, for myself only. I was one of the people that was involved with this election task force, and I've presented my views through the bank several times previously. It was a 10-3 vote there for that report. I was one of the 3 people that voted no because I feel that the city clerk we should maintain the elections with the city clerk. I feel that while we had several issues that were pertaining to our neighborhood council, and in terms of primarily the scheduling, trying to schedule the right date, because we have stakeholders who can't vote on certain days and so forth, and going through that process to finally get a date that was applicable, that was appropriate for everybody was a bit of a problem, and some other concerns that we had. I feel that for this next cycle, the city clerk would be able to, we'd be able to work out the problems, and they'd be able to make the adjustments so that it would run smoother in the future. Also, I would urge that you to keep the outreach component with the city, with this fund with the city clerk, so that they can do the outreach for us, because there's tremendous internal battles sometimes over trying to get funding for outreach, and the boards don't want to do it, and not everybody's interested in outreach. So please keep the outreach with the city clerk. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Cindy Cleghorn, followed by Nina Royal. And Ms. Cleghorn, you have a general public comment as well as a comment on this item card. If you're welcome to speak to both now, if you'd like.
Can I do that?
Yeah, sure.
I'll do that.
We're easy around here.
I'll do this one, and then I'll do that one afterwards, right after. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. I'm Cindy Cleghorn, and I serve on the board of the Sunland-Tujunga Neighborhood Council. I also serve on the executive committee for the Valley Alliance of Neighborhood Councils and Plan Check NC. I first wanted to make a comment on behalf of the Valley Alliance that they have not taken a formal position with regards to NC elections. They'll be doing so at their April 14th meeting. I have 5 points about this topic. With our goal being to get more candidates, we were hampered with the city clerk handling our elections because we didn't know that we had all candidate seats filled. It was very closed off for us, so it made it more cumbersome and difficult. The object trying to get more voters, yes, we did expect that pamphlet to go out. It really was something that we had expected. I served on the Neighborhood Council Review Commission, and I remember that being something that we all looked forward to, but it did not happen. So we didn't get the outreach that we had anticipated. A more cost-effective method is the IEA system. It worked, and it is something to be seriously considered to be brought back and working with the department. A comment with regards to extending the neighborhood council elections, I hope that you won't do that. Our stakeholders look forward to participating in voting their representatives to the neighborhood council system, plus many are tired and they want to move on and look forward to other things to do. I see this as a problem that could occur where people will resign and then we'll be filling seats on an appointed basis and it won't involve the stakeholders. And we need to engage always and involve the stakeholders. With regards to e-voting, my last little comment, that e-voting should be looked at very seriously. It's not fine-tuned and we need to see it more broadly spread around the city before taking that on because it's serious. Okay. Now, for my general public comment, I'm serving as chair for the Neighborhood Council Congress, and I wanted to announce that the Congress will be held on September 24th, so save the date. I want to be sure that you're included, and all the committee members, and to make sure that everyone knows, and it will be held here at City Hall. And so that was my brief, quick public comment with regards to the Congress, and anybody who wants to participate and get involved with planning the Congress, especially all neighborhood councils across the city, they should see me, and we'll be meeting at the Los Angeles Neighborhood Council Coalition on April 2nd for our next committee meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Nina Royal, followed by Dr. Wiseman.
Good evening, Nina Royal, Summa Tahunga, and I am a former member of the board. I'm off this year, but I was one of the founding members and on the board for 8 years. I agree with everything that Judy Price said and everything that Cindy Cleghorn said, but I also want to add, because of my newspaper, I'm a stakeholder in 15 neighborhood councils. That's ridiculous. I did vote in the Glassell Park Neighborhood Council when I found out that a specialized group coming up from Orange County, which made their turnout be 1,000 people, were there to vote. And I thought it was really terrible that the community has a vote taken away from them by outsiders. I also had someone vote in my neighborhood council. All they had to do was go next door and get a receipt from a grocery store in order to vote. That also should not be. I hope that if we are going to change our system, you give it back to the neighborhood councils, and we work out a plan where each neighborhood council mentors another neighborhood council with the elections, like they're going to be doing with the grievances. That way it takes away from the expenses, and that the city clerk and Dunn put all that money towards outreach, and we'll take care of our own. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Wiseman, followed by Kelly Lord. Dr. Wiseman.
I asked for time on the public comment as well. I'll do my best to keep both of these less than the 4 minutes that would mean.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Again, my congratulations to all participating in this particular process. It's very impressive. I think as far as the city clerk taking the elections, I'm going to tell you something that has nothing to do with city attorney, city business. As of today, I am once again a licensed physician in the state of California. It's a different issue. My friends will know what I'm talking about later. But I'm going to now accept you as my patient, and probably my first patient. And I've told you before that the neighborhood councils have been in their adolescence.
No, I'm a pediatrician. I want to tell you that we are now in our young adulthood. And you look at the people who are in back of me here. We're no longer the adolescent who's looking to get acceptance and to break away from parental control and to be their own responsible parties. These people are now young adults. Look at the people behind me. Couldn't be prouder to be part of their activities. And it's long past due that they were recognized by that in these hallowed halls. The issues of who should run the city's election has been your prime concern tonight. It's my personal opinion, and I've stated it before, that the neighborhood councils, now that they are adults, have the capacity to run their own elections. And we've never asked for money in the first place to do it. Coastal San Pedro showed the way. Many other councils have showed the way to do it. Perhaps the task force that has given you this remarkable report today can be considered as a permanent resource to be able to be that guiding light for elections in the future. Now, the next issue I want to talk about is the factual basis.
Sorry, Dr. Weisman, just for the record, you did fill out 2 cards, so please proceed with the second issue. So.
It's easy for me to run on. It's just part of the package.
Just want to make sure everyone else understood why you were running on past the buzzer. So.
Well, I want my 5 seconds back. That's all right. At any rate, the factual basis was created by the NCRC as a way to try to get more inclusion, more people involved. Now, as you all know, I'm the poster boy for a factual-based neighborhood council member or neighborhood council stakeholder. The problem with the factual basis definition is it said self-affirmation. But I would propose to you that the affirmation of the factual-based stakeholder should be the approval of the neighborhood council involved. I'm very proud of the fact that I moved from one neighborhood council to another, and I was approved, accepted, and I've been serving on their board for the last 4 years. And an anecdote, just a remark about why I don't think the city clerk is perfect by a long shot. When I went to vote on the last elections in 2010, I couldn't show that I was a person who lived, worked, or owned property in that area, because I didn't. And they said, well, you can't vote. I said, well, you know, I think I can qualify. He said, no, you can't vote. You don't live, work, or own property. I said, my name's on the election. I'm one of the candidates. Oh, yes, you can vote. Thank you very much. But I could do that because I had been given the approval and the acceptance of the neighborhood council that I work with now. And I think that's the way it should be done. I'm going to go back to this adolescent-adult analogy and give you the famous story that most of you perhaps know from Mark Twain. There's a story about a young man that Mark Twain liked to tell, and the young man was really having trouble with his father and has discipline problems, and he said, you know, Dad, you don't understand anything about me. And he was 16 years old, and he was really very bitter and very unhappy. And the story goes that 3 years later, when he was 19, he went to his father once more, and he said, you know, Dad, you've learned a lot in the last 3 years. Well, we've learned a lot in the last 3 years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kelly Lord, followed by Jeff Jacoberger. Is Kelly Lord here?
Yes.
Is that him rushing up here? Okay. Okay. Well, if Kelly Lord is not here, then we'll go to Jeff Jacoberger, followed by Tony Wilkinson.
Just a couple comments. One, everyone talks about the factual basis stakeholder. If you actually read the charter, the first words of the charter, Section 900, are to promote more citizen participation in government. And then if you look at Section 906, it says membership at a minimum shall be those who live, work, and own property. And so I'm not sure why we're striving for minimum participation as opposed to maximum participation. One thing about the cost of the city clerk, when I was on the 912 Commission, one of the reasons we decided to give it to the city clerk is because the city clerk mentioned he has his staff who runs the municipal elections. And then during the off years, they're sort of less than fully employed. And so they would be available to run the the neighborhood council elections. And there's some concern if you decide, okay, we're going to eliminate these people and we're going to fire all these people in the off years, how are you going to actually be able to maintain a professional staff to in the city clerk's office to run the municipal elections? And so I think you should take a close look is what real cost savings are you actually going to be able to achieve if you take it completely away from the city clerk. And I also think if you just give it completely to neighborhood councils, I mean, that's not going to work because you then need somebody to review all of the neighborhood council procedures to make sure that they're actually fair. I live in a community that has a large Orthodox Jewish population. You might think, oh, a Saturday election, that's great. Not in my neighborhood, you're actually disenfranchising people. So if my neighborhood council gets to develop its own election procedures, some grown-up, whoever it is, the city clerk, Dunn, Bonk, somebody, needs to be reviewing all of those election procedures, and I think so a lot of the cost savings from going away from a universal standardized system are actually illusory if you want an effective system. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Tony Wilkinson, followed by Heinrich Kiefer.
Tony Wilkinson from Panorama City, and we conducted our own election actually for our interim board with the help of Dunn before the days of IEAs. We conducted 2 IEA elections, all without challenge. I think that clearly the IEA system has been proven to be the lowest cost way to run elections. I think the clerk we have a wonderful city clerk. I'm amazed, I'm happy with the city clerk's performance of the elections. I don't want the enthusiasm of some neighborhood councils for electronic voting to distract from the basic issue, though, which is the cost of the city clerk in this budget crisis is simply too large to get the elections done. And I think that the elections are critical to the outreach which is required of all of our councils. I really think it would be terrible not to have the elections. And what I'd love to see is the council to perhaps suspend the city clerk's participation for this 2012 election cycle and recognize by ordinance, if necessary, what the city attorney was talking about, the ability of councils not only to have this election process, but also to actually run their own elections, perhaps give a stipend to the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment in your budgeting. They may want $800,000, you might give them $500,000, but significantly less than the city clerk, and allow the neighborhood councils to have in their budgets expected outreach expenses because that is, I concur, a critical responsibility of the local council. Will need to be funded for that as well. It will save the city $1 million and it will give us all elections. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Heinrich Kiefer, if he's still here, followed by Rosemary DeMont.
Hello, I'm Rosemary DeMonte. I'm from the Greater Griffith Park Neighborhood Council, and our council was the one that had the greatest turnout. And I would say that the greatest turnout it did not need the city clerk at all because we had 2 slates running that were very aggressive and very political, so much so that one of the candidates in this winning slate ran on to try to become a city council person. My problem with that is that this is a grassroots organization, and I know I have been the election person since 2004 on our neighborhood council. I've been through all the processes, and we have a problem with people who would love to be part of a neighborhood council and are not political creatures. They don't know how to campaign. So my point would be that the best participation we got for candidates and everything was the 2008 election with the city clerk, when the city clerk sent out an outreach for the candidates and and that was once where we really got a lot of people. This 2010, they were not participating in that. I spent probably the same amount of money as they did and didn't get anything back from that. I maybe got 2 strangers out of that because the slates that were working got their own candidates. So I believe that somehow or another, if outreach were to be held by this, in the pockets of the city, it would be better. As the lady said, neighborhood councils don't have the money to reach all the members. And one size fits all, unfortunately, does not work for grassroots. That's the problem with the city clerk. One size fits all. But the other important thing is stakeholder status. Someone says that, we have to have participation by everybody, but I think that these people can vote in their own neighborhood council rather than come to another one. Ours, we had 57% of factual basis work, people who voted. So potentially, our district representatives could have been voted in by not one person in their district. So I believe that has to really seriously be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ivan Spiegel, followed by Alexia Turan.
Okay. Good evening, councilmen and commissioners. My name is Ivan Spiegel. I'm the Parliamentarian at the Venice Neighborhood Council. I've been asked to tell you officially that our council voted to approve the Election Task Force report. So we're part of that. Now to wear another hat. My background is I've been running elections for years and years and years. I'm a registered county poll worker and a city poll worker. And I actually took the training and got to sit behind the table at these elections. The city clerk did an incredible job. I can probably state that the Venice Neighborhood Council would not be functioning right now if it wasn't for the city clerk. There were threats of lawsuit, there was harassment, they handled it. It was great. However, it cost a lot of money. So that's why my council decided to turn around and say, well, even though we love them, maybe we want to go a cheaper route. Some things that you need to know. The city clerk's procedures fell apart with the grievance. Okay? The people doing grievances should not be the same people running the elections. Because when something comes in that says you need to rehold this election, the city clerk has to come out of their budget. Okay? So they're inclined to not go ahead and do that. There are dysfunctional councils out there. Maybe it's a little less than half. I'm working with one right now that's about to go into receivership. If they had to have an election next week, they couldn't do it. There are a lot of councils out there. You have to ensure that these people that are not as sophisticated as some of the others have a chance to participate in city government. You have to look out for them. Last thing is about the money. Please don't set up a system where it costs more for the election than we end up with to spend as a neighborhood council. What's the point? Take away all our money, who needs to be there? Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Alexia Turan, followed by Antonio Ramirez.
Good evening, and thank you for this time. My name is Alexia Terán. I live in Cypress Park. I'm on the board of the Greater Cypress Neighborhood Council, and this is my third term, which I didn't want to do because there weren't enough people. I had to do it. Having said that, this is perfect what he just mentioned because I'm piggybacking on that. And some people don't understand that there are people out there who are not as well educated as some of you are. They're not attorneys. And so if we want to start at the beginning, as the plan mentioned, we have to include everyone. We can't include everyone, that's true, but we have to try. Therefore, this is not a democratic process. Isn't that true? At the start of the movement, Don didn't have enough experience. Neither did many of us. That's true. They said one thing, then it went back and forth. It's been a long process. Even government, which has been in existence for so long, how many hundreds of years, still can't do it correctly. We all know that. You're asking the NCs to have better outreach. Yes, that's true. That's a fact, and we all need to do that. The elected officials who run the city and get paid have lots of funding to do their outreach, and some of them get elected with 500 votes. I know that for a fact, and so do you. They have more experience than they have much more experience than staff, volunteers, and so on and so forth. And again, they've been doing this for many, many years. Yet you expect us with maybe a couple of years or 10 at the most to do it as well as they can? No, I'm sorry. It cannot be done. So please look at that. Yes, I understand the procedure, policies, rules, etc., have to be taken into account. I do that. But again, I go back to NC's having so few years in existence. Electronic voting is good for most of you. Guess what? Some people still have no idea what this is about. In the libraries, you have to reserve a certain time and certain day, and if you're not there, guess what? You get bumped up. I'm sorry, I needed just a couple of seconds, if I may. When you don't include everyone, then is this democratic? No, it's not. There's lots of cultures who come here from other countries who are afraid of government. We all know that, so how can we involve them? We have to do continuous outreach, talk to them. In my neighborhood, I lived there for almost 50 years. There are some people from other cultures who live there almost as long as I have. They go by, we say hello, and that's it. I invited them to something safe, like the opening of our library. You think they participate? No. They go into the community where they have their own culture.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry. We have to be fair to everybody. Our next speaker is Antonio Ramirez, followed by Adrian O'Neill.
This is a matter of principle. Good question. How do you make the bylaws if you don't have standards or a high standard bar without getting into the Brown Act laws, which eventually you do stumble into and heinously violate? That being the law-abiding Mexicans, Americans, and honorable, brave, and courageous, brilliant military veterans, who many are homeless and are chronically impoverished with their families because they are not pussies nor sell out their single-minded patriotic convictions. I love and respect the United States military veterans and all pilots, which you often violate because you deny them and me our First Amendment right to freely speak on and input our experiences, thus denying us our democratic process in the elections and the right to have and live in a safe, happy, and thriving neighborhoods. That is our number one human plight. We now have a two-pronged problem affecting our communities, that being the overcrowding of criminal illegal aliens and their byproduct gangbangers, the chronic criminal gangbanging empire most notorious in the sanctuary cities of East Los Angeles, i.e. gang-banging kingpins Ophelia Rodriguez, Luis Rodriguez, and Felipe Rodriguez in the city of Maywood. Their motto is to thrash, kill, and destroy all the neighborhoods which are just, decent, and pure. So strip all these sanctuary cities and their criminal safe haven status and deport all illegal gangbangers and aliens and hasta la vista. And their goal is to obliterate all American democratic sovereignty, which is something that the American military veterans and I verbally fight to maintain and uphold on a daily basis. However, Monica Lozano and the reckless false media empire Chango La Opinion newspaper tries to hide and distort the truth to the American readers. That's why I, as an American, Mexican-American, try to expose the truth with full transparency of the wicked and malicious and evil media has hijacked, thus falsely dissuade the Latino voters, while you, big politicos, keep importing all these third world illegal criminal alien gangbangers and cheap unethical laborers. Conversely, you have sabotaged us. May I please finish this?
Finish the sentence.
You have sabotaged us in our safe, habitable neighborhoods, and our human dignity has been endangered. Thus, the question that I ask is, so who is the American democratic process objectively protecting and edifying? The American law-abiding citizens or the criminal illegal gangbangers?
Thank you very much, ma'am. Next speaker is Adrian O'Neill, followed by Albert Olson.
I'm Adrian O'Neill. I'm the president of Harbor Gateway South Neighborhood Council. I also sit on the boards of 3 intercity groups, 2 for the DWP and 1 for Plan Check. I think that we need to take a very, very concerned look at all of these things that have been discussed this evening, one of which is the factual basis stakeholder. We don't want them in our neighborhood council. You can talk to any one of my board members and they will tell you, no, we don't want this. We don't think it's right. We don't think it's fair. There are other neighborhood councils that think it is necessary for their own neighborhood councils. Let them have their factual basis stakeholders. I think this is something that could be decided by individual neighborhood councils as opposed to one size fits all. I also, since we were at the Harbor, we had our neighborhood council election scheduled on the state election day. It was a very, very improper thing to do. all of the Harbor neighborhood councils requested that the date be changed. The date would not be changed by the city clerk. Consequently, we all had extremely low turnout. It's a wonder any of us got elected at all, as a matter of fact. And so I and my council are extremely for having the neighborhood councils run their own elections. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Albert Olson, followed by Steve Patel.
Hi, I'm Albert Olson. I'm chair of the Mar Vista Community Council, but I'm speaking only for myself tonight. Our council is in the process of formulating a position on the NC elections, and we'll be sending that to you probably this month. But I believe the legitimacy of the neighborhood council system is really at stake here. If we as NCs are portraying ourselves as being a viable and responsible part of our city's system of government, and if we are asking to be taken seriously as legitimate elected representatives of our community, then we need to be elected in the same manner, with the same rules and by the same system that elects other legislative members of our body politic. In the case of the City of LA, the established voting system is the city clerk's office, and that is where I believe the neighborhood council elections should be administered also. When voting by email has become a proven and established method for holding fair and transparent elections, then I suspect that we might have such a method for the entire city of LA, and at that point it would certainly be appropriate for neighborhood councils also. Suggestions that a town hall method might be a permissible way to hold a neighborhood council election for councils that have anywhere from 20,000 to 55,000, and I hear now even 80,000 stakeholders, seems to me to be a recipe for entrenched incumbency, for intimidation of new stakeholders that might want to run for election, and for boards to perpetuate their current members indefinitely. Before we throw in the towel on the idea of having the city clerk's office run our elections, I would recommend that we actually sit down with them and hold serious discussions as to how the legitimate needs of neighborhood council elections can be met. I suspect that reincorporating the possibility of vote by mail combined with a traditional day of polling will give neighborhood councils the flexibility to respond to most of their stakeholder needs. But by keeping the elections under the city umbrella of the city clerk's office, we are representing to the people and to the city that our voting processes are fair, transparent, and equitable, and we can truly call ourselves elected officials in the same manner that any other of our traditional representatives can use that term.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Steve Patel, followed by Don Wiggins.
Councilman Kokorian. A couple of things. I'm going to speak from a couple of perspectives. One is I helped actually administer 2 elections for 2 new neighborhood councils that were coming on board last year, Northridge South Neighborhood Council and North Hills East Neighborhood Council. And what I learned from that is 2 different demographics, 2 different needs. So having a system imposed on 92, 93 neighborhood council, I would caution you. I would say it might do more damage than good. As the good doctor just mentioned, we're growing. We have the neighborhood council, and each neighborhood council is in a different level of maturity. Some of them being established now where they can manage their own elections. Some of them are fairly new or, as somebody pointed out, in disarray. They may not be able to handle the election by themselves. What I would request for your consideration is, why don't we have it so that we have a menu of services that we can pick and choose based on the neighborhood council's comfort level. They can either say, you know what, we want the city clerk to handle all of it, or we can say, no, we can handle the city clerk and do the administration part, we can do the outreach part, or anything in between. Like I said, each demographics requires, what's the definition of a stakeholder? My advice is have a sort of an initial set of definition that applies to all 92, 93 neighborhood councils, and then allow the neighborhood councils to come up with or fine-tune based on their demographics and their needs. If we did that, then we're doing one thing what I think this whole purpose is all about, which is grassroots and representing our community. Just because the neighborhood council might be in disarray, that doesn't mean that the community itself needs to suffer. So I think we as neighborhood council people, we represent the community, and I don't think the community needs to pay the price for a system that works for some and not for the others. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next speaker is Don Dwiggins, followed by Stephen Box.
I'm Don Dwiggins, Northridge East Neighborhood Council, and about a 50-year software developer. I want to speak to the electronic voting, whether by email or e-voting, whatever. One of the basic principles of making a voting system open and transparent is that voters can have the capability of auditing the voting process from beginning to end, from where votes get cast to the final tallies. A proprietary voting system interferes with that. The proprietariness of the software and so forth makes it difficult, if not impossible, to track when a vote goes in what happens before it comes out and gets tallied. There have been problems with this in a variety of districts and at a number of government levels. And so I would simply offer this, that if an electronic voting system is to be used, that this particular issue be paid very careful attention to, because it has to do with the fundamental business of properly and accounting voters' results. Pardon me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Next speaker is Stephen Box, followed by Cliff Jacobs. Mr. Box, welcome.
Councilman, Commissioners. How you doing, Mr. Kim? Stephen Box, former independent election administrator and veteran of 25 neighborhood council elections. And I just wanted to, one, commend the task force on the work they've done and on your work in bringing it to the marketplace of ideas, if you will. And on behalf of Jose Segala, who has been taking this idea on the road, I wanted to mention, kind of in response also to Commissioner Kim, who said that one of the key elements to the election process is the definition of neighborhood councils. Who are they? What are they? What do they do? Why is that relevant to me, the stakeholder? And the importance of outreach, not just
our channel.